Hi, and welcome to Millennial Z and Boomer X. I am Boomer X,
And I'm Millennial Z.
and thank you for joining us today. This is podcast number 9, and we are going to talk about the recent big news, to me anyway, the Russia and China Pact. And that is extremely interesting to me as I grew up during the Red Scare and communism and all that in the Soviet Union. The former Soviet Union now, but Russia taking their place, and their divided countries, and China also still being China, even though we have a lot more free trade and a lot more diplomatic relations with them. But I'm going to read the first paragraph of the article from the New Yorker that was put out 4 days ago, and it's extremely interesting, the language used in the article and how the quotes were given. But it reads that Vladimir Putin and China's Xi Jinping last week declared a new era in the global order and, at least in the short term, endorsed their respective territorial ambitions in Ukraine and Taiwan. The world's two most powerful autocrats unveiled a sweeping long-term agreement that also challenges the United States as a global power, NATO as a cornerstone of international security, and liberal democracy as a model for the world. Quote, friendship between the two states has no limits, they vowed in the communique released after the two leaders met on the eve of Beijing Winter Olympics. Quote, there are no forbidden areas of cooperation, unquote. So I, that's a clear message if I ever read one.
Yeah.
And of course, the writer placed it in that it was due to their respective territorial ambitions in the Ukraine and Taiwan. And of course, the United States has given each country grief about their geopolitical ambitions of reacquiring those territories. And it appears that China and Russia are allying to show the world that, one, they won't be pushed around by the United States and NATO, and that they are no cooperation is forbidden, implying obviously that they would go to war for each other.
Yeah.
But
They'll back each other up if things come to those terms.
right, they clearly didn't say that because that's not what diplomats say, and everybody leaves room for backtracking, and that's not what I said, and all that as being political individuals. But that certainly, and the way the article was presented as labeling them autocrats instead of simple nation leaders, it starts to be a bit interesting that everybody seeming to assume their past places as the United States being the bulwark of democracy, and they labeled as liberal democracy, implying that it was nice and freedom loving and compassionate, while they were autocrats, meaning dictatorial tyrants without real democracy because they're not really allowed to vote, or if they do, they don't count them.
Right.
So, and they didn't say that, of course, but like I said, the language chosen by the author was interesting. And the fact that they issued those statements as just the two small quotes is a clear message that they are extremely interested in their respective territorial ambitions and don't wish to be meddled with,
hmm
and will stand up to anybody who does so, and they have the backing of someone else. So
Yeah.
again, it just reminds me of the 70s and early 80s all over again, and the 60s somewhat, although I don't remember much of that. And it should make everybody go, huh, for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. These two conflicts are very interesting with, in respect to China's intentions of taking Taiwan and Russia trying to get Ukraine back is they're very similar to each other historically because they have a lot of similarities in reasons to get those areas geographically and a lot of history with separate countries in mind as well that they either were successful at getting or semi-successful at getting comparatively for the same reasons as in China for Korea and Russia for Crimea. And it's kind of like this weird. They have a lot of parallel history with these two countries.
Right. Well, the interesting thing is Taiwan was a Chinese country forever until the Japanese occupied it and then left it at the end of World War II and was almost a British colony, although the records now state that it never was. It was simply a British stronghold or military installation, and they were to turn it back over to China at the end of the 20th century, which they have done. And during that time, Taiwan declared itself an independent territory, but it was always a Chinese territory, or understood to be a Chinese territory, but because of its location was always under contention for one reason or another. And the Ukrainian people are the same stock as the Russians, really, and have a lot of overlap and crossover. And the Ukraine has applied to NATO, and I don't know if your age group is aware of this, but the NATO was reported every night in the news in the 70s almost, and it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it's a changing group of countries, but it's mostly Canada, the United States, and Europe, with a couple of Eurasian countries in there as well. And they united as a military and economic force against the Soviet Union, essentially.
Right. Yeah, against communism was the
That
essential
was their
underline.
that was their thing. Yes.
Hmm.
Again, the Red Scare was a real thing in the
Hmm.
50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Not so much after the Berlin Wall came down and China began to realize that capitalism was necessary and communism was a failed economic
That's what I
idea.
wanted to ask you was how prevalent was the Red Scare to you while growing up? I know it ended supposedly around 91 or 89, depending on how people want to count it, because they count technically the Berlin Wall collapsing as the end of Soviet Union, but then some people say 1991 because of internal conflict and them finally establishing you know, their
Right.
own organization.
I pretty much say the symbolism of '89 is good enough because when they allowed the Berlin Wall to be beaten down, that was the end. The
Hmm.
fact that they didn't rebuild enough to create their own state, a workable state,
Hmm.
united until '91, that's their problem. But
Right.
it was obviously done when the wall was beaten down by the inhabitants of the country.
So
Uh,
how prevalent was it to you? Because from me growing up, I I mean I still get the same propaganda towards Russia is bad is essentially the underlining tone.
well, that's because that's what the media tells us, you
Hmm.
know, and they have their own interests. You have to respect the president for that. They're always looking out for the country's best interests. And economically, they have had a difficult time since World War II, and they lost all of those people. They suffered more casualties than the rest of the Allies
Yeah.
combined fighting the Germans.
Yeah, it was some insane number, like 30
It's
million people or
it's
something.
unbelievable, and that was in war. It was, and they didn't have that many
Maybe
people to
more.
begin with.
I could be
Right.
lowballing that quite a bit.
Yeah, I don't remember the figures, but it was an astronomical number. And because of that, they didn't have many people to actually do the labor and make the work. They had brain drain from people trying to leave or being killed during World War II. And they've truly been struggling ever since.
Hmm.
And of course, struggling under socialist policies does not make it easier. Uh, Being isolated makes it worse. And I'm not placing blame on any particular political group. I'm saying that's simply the way it worked out.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing. I remember watching some documentaries on World War II Soviet side of the perspective on the war, and a lot of them were fleeing Russia to try to get to Germany and Nazi regime. And they were like, "Yeah, the Nazis are pretty crazy, but it's better than what's going on over here," is what they were pretty much
Yeah, and
saying.
that's and people will call you all kind of names for that, but that was a reality.
Right.
Nobody wanted to be because they had no resources, and if you were a prisoner, you
Hmm.
were going to be placed in worse condition than the actual soldiers, and the soldiers had it rough as well.
Right.
So, and the inhabitants, the regular people, the private citizens had it very rough because they had to support them and worry about soldiers on both sides. It was truly bad. But essentially, anyone who could carry a gun and shoot in Russia that time, that they were a soldier,
Yeah.
regardless of age, gender, didn't matter. In fact, their best sniper was a woman, and I don't think anybody since then has beat her record. It's pretty unbelievable. And during that time period, it was unheard of, but that just shows you what people are capable of when they have no choice. And
Hmm.
they truly had no choice. It was pretty nuts back then. But that changed their culture entirely, and they are no nonsense people. Uh, I don't have any Russian in my blood, and as far as I know, you don't have any in yours. So I don't have any familial ties or anything. I'm just simply looking at it from an overview of that's simply how they are.
Right.
Um, and of course, every individual is different. I'm speaking about culturally. And the Chinese, again, no nonsense. When they started, when communism took over, Mao killed over 40 million of his own people in the name of communism, and it spread to Korea, Cambodia, Vietnam, kicked off those wars. Uh, those 40 million people were people killed by their own people for a political ideal of communism. That was a real thing.
Yeah.
And we thought they were a genuine threat. And the real threat, though, was nuclear war being kicked off. And I remember for years thinking we could have the bomb dropped on us at any time. And that was not a false consideration.
Right.
Not so much today. Very good. But it does seem like they are gearing up to help each other for their own political interests. But they also know they can't trust each other because they are two very different cultures, even though they may espouse similar economic and government ideals, even though they use different names for it. They're essentially doing the same thing to their citizenry and believe in a certain type of government.
Hmm.
But the United States, of course, being very prosperous and cash full, and the China is now too. They own a lot of our debt, and there's still a lot of trade with them. So it's going to be very interesting to see how we move forward with this. But the U.S. has ships and troops along the border near Ukraine and near Taiwan. So,
Yeah, a lot of equations were met with Taiwan to Cuba because essentially it's we're the we're the threat to, as into helping Taiwan, and Taiwan's the Cuba of this scenario because they're essentially the same distance from the mainland as Cuba was
right,
to
and they're
Florida.
an island, and they're a
Hmm.
separate. If they're declared themselves an independent state, the
Hmm.
difference is though that Taiwan, as a rule, wants nothing to do with China, as I understand it. The citizenry. I don't know about the government. I'm not clear, and there's conflicts there, so I'm not
Well,
going to claim that.
so technically, from what
But in
I read, was that China, well, the Chinese leader, the Republic of China leader, fled to Taiwan, and then supposedly Taiwan's adopted that, essentially that government agency of the Republic of China. So technically, they do consider themselves China, but they want the rest of China
well,
to
that's
be not Republic or not the CCP anymore. They want it to be the
right.
back to
They
the.
don't want it to be communist. They want it to be well. That's the thing. The Republic of China lost that internal conflict. They lost that war, and communist China took over. CCP took over, and that's who runs it.
Right.
So it, the
I'm just giving the
ROP.
perspectives of
Yeah,
why the
I'm just thinking about how it actually went down because my Bagua Zhang teacher was a colonel in the Republican Army of China. So it was a real thing. And he was old. He was in his 90s when I studied under him. And that was the thing. He fled to Taiwan and then he fled to the United States back in the 60s. So, of course, that was a real thing. But that government only exists in Taiwan. It's been long gone in China since the 50s, long
yeah,
gone,
yeah,
late 50s. So to say that, yeah, we're Chinese, but we're not communist Chinese, that means you're not a part of that government. And that's what they're trying to rectify. And that's my point.
right.
So if they're saying that they're not, again, they're having conflicts, but they're right next door. The difference in Cuba was Cuba readily accepted communism because the people were treated so poorly, and Fidel Castro led a revolution to overthrow the oligarchs in Cuba who were espousing capitalism, and they thought their life would be better because they had it so bad for so long, and they accepted communism.
Hmm.
Taiwan apparently doesn't want communism, and they want the U.S. to help them,
Hmm.
but that's a big difference.
Yeah.
Cuba didn't want us over there, and they were right next door. You know, it's
Well, I'm saying we're switching sides is what I'm getting at for that, which I find interesting because like
right,
we would
right.
be we would be the Communist Party essentially under that, but
Trying
not
to, oh,
really.
I see how you are. Yeah, we're trying to inflict our will onto
Hmm.
Taiwan, and that country next door wants it to be
Yeah,
capitalist in nature.
we've been given huge arm funding to Taiwan since the 90s, earlier than
Sure.
that, 79 or
Yeah,
something. But
because we knew that at the end of the year 2000 that treaty would occur and allegedly would revert back to China. But now they're playing legal and political games instead of simply allowing the mother country of China to assume it. Because again, they declared independence, and I believe it was in the 90s. So I'm sure that was part of their entire plan to not do it, you know,
mhm,
to not revert back. And that treaty was drawn up, if I remember correctly, by Britain, British treaty. Like I said, they used to have a naval and army base there that was huge, which is why they speak English and have a lot of English signs there and drive on the left-hand side of the road.
mhm.
So if you look at the older films, you can see some of that in Taiwan, and the British were the police and the military over there. But they left there years ago, decades ago, in the 90s, into the 90s, and they were preparing for it for years. So I'm sure those political statements were a part of it.
Yeah.
Um, but it's also very clear that China and Russia are going to continue to move forward and recapture that lost territory of
Mhm.
Ukraine and Taiwan.
Yeah, that's definitely their intentions. They made that very clear. I'm wondering how far other countries are willing to go to make that not happen, because I know NATO has been very determined to encroach on Ukraine's independency and Georgia and multiple other Eurasian
Well,
countries.
the Ukraine has applied for membership in NATO, and that
Hmm.
would certainly be a slap in the face to Russia because they've always viewed NATO as the enemy
Hmm.
and have no desire or interest in being a member of NATO. So, yeah, I'm sure that would create huge problems. Now, they haven't been accepted, as far as I know, because
Yeah.
they realize what the repercussions of that are. If they're accepted formally as a NATO member and Russia goes in, then every NATO country would have to go to their defense.
Well,
Right now, as I understand it, there's only a handful of countries gearing up to assist.
technically, they joined in the DCFTA well, that's why the 2014 Crimean annexation and all that happened
Hmm.
was um, Ukraine joined the DCFTA, which is a deep and comprehensive free trade area. They did that with Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. Essentially, the same free market trading routes and agreements they
Hmm.
had with the rest of with NATO, they extended to those countries.
Hmm.
And obviously, Russia found that as very offensive and encroaching on their influence sphere, as they like to say on some articles.
Sure. Sure.
Quoting them, their
Right.
influence sphere. I like it, but yeah, I can see their point to it is because if they join over to the NATO side, then NATO's literally knocking on their door. They have Ukraine technically as a buffer zone, right?
Right.
But if they take over Ukraine, then Ukraine becomes the next front line towards Russia, and
Right. Yeah.
they don't like that at all. So,
No, and as a country that's has potentially hostile neighbors all the time, yeah, you don't want that. You don't want them
mhm,
moving closer to your house, hostile neighbors closer to your house. You want a
right.
buffer of some sort. And currently, Turkey has always been the buffer,
Hmm.
Um, but that would be another country closer, the Ukraine on
Hmm.
the other side of Turkey. Uh,
Yeah, Ukraine owns the Black Sea port that allows all of that port
mhm.
access for Russia to make all those
Oh, it would
types
it would certainly be
trade for it.
a very strategic location for a NATO country,
Yeah.
and they are well aware of it. But more importantly than that, Russia wants the Ukraine back in the Russian fold. They're not
Hmm.
calling it the Soviet Union, and as far as I know, they don't have socialist policies as part of the government, meaning they own all means of production, but it's still they want a stronger union so they can have better free trade, more economic trade, and give a better shot at capitalism. I mean, if you're a tiny nation with few populace, you don't have very much activity going on respective to a much larger populace and a larger resources available to you.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering. I like seeing the articles on both sides because I try to read if I can get my hands on some of the other side of it because it's
Hmm.
very hard just to do
Right.
a skimming Google result. You're only going to get one side of the story, which is
Sure.
really infuriating because I
Hmm.
know there's two sides to the story, you know.
It's the same story that's been going on for quite some time. You can see back in the early 2000 teens that China and Russia were making friends with each other or being pleasant to each other. As I said before, they obviously don't trust each other and they have their own issues. But China desperately wants to continue trade with the U.S. and Europe, and that's NATO.
Hmm.
If hostilities start, the first thing that's going to happen is economic shutdown.
Embargo, yeah, for
Hmm.
sure.
And same for Russia. And they're hurting. They're still hurting. They're in better shape than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago, but they're still hurt. And to have
Yeah,
the most liquid, resource rich, and productive people on the planet deliberately avoid you and not do business with you is going to be crippling without firing a single shot. And they're well aware of that. I believe it shows how scared they are when they posture like this and show an alliance and issue statements like there's no amount of cooperation that's forbidden between us, implying that if you invade one, we'll certainly help, or we could
mhm.
help, you know, not certainly, but we could help because there's nothing's forbidden between us. We're buddies now, you know.
Yeah, it's definitely a postulation, but I mean, I wouldn't say they're scared, but because they definitely have a
Oh,
lot of leverage.
they do, simply because they do have a considerable number of people, huge armies,
Yeah.
uh, large naval,
Russia still has nukes, and they're
and,
still
and they both
really
have
very
nukes. They
they're
both
very
have them,
part of the cyber war. China's very
right?
part of the cyber war.
Right. I mean, there's lots of destruction that can be had,
Mhm.
and everyone would suffer mightily. But why mention it unless you're being bothered by something?
Oh, for
Otherwise,
sure.
it's understood. So I think they're very bothered by the fact that the U.S. has dropped troops and
Hmm.
ships right next to those areas of contention.
Hmm.
And that's what it shows me. That shows me they're very bothered, and they're bothered and a bit frightened, even though they may not want to use that word. You didn't have to present it that way. You know what I mean? You could have done it a different way. You could have called a meeting, and I'm sure our politicos would have shown up and wanted to discuss it, but they didn't. They issued a public statement
Yeah.
saying those things.
Yeah, they're definitely strong arming a bit.
Hmm. Right, right, right.
Which I
Um,
mean, I guess is they're
you're
always
either
in their
angry
tactic.
or responding like that in the public on a global level. You're either angry or scared.
Hmm.
You
I'm
know.
sure they're I'm sure they're both. I mean, China still has, even though they export, from what I could gather, they export around $64 billion worth of food. They still need $104 billion worth of food because they import that much. So
Hmm.
that alone, if everybody embargoed them, and they're not getting it from Russia because Russia imports more food than they can export,
Yeah,
obviously.
they're not very productive because they're simply behind
Mhm.
technologically.
And
And
yeah, and their geographic stance doesn't
hmm
allow them to be able to provide as much food for
hmm
China.
yeah, we've
So,
we've even when they were the Soviet Union, we sold them wheat
mhm.
by the megaton.
Yeah. So,
Um,
but there's a lot of pushback with that. I mean, China makes the most silicon by a lot, and then second is Russia. But China's making 5.4 million metric tons of silicon, whereas in
that's
Russia's making
because they're
400,
they're
540 metric tons or 500.
yeah
Yeah,
It's not even close.
540,000, I think.
Well, that's strictly because China is making everybody's electronics pretty much.
Well,
The
Taiwan's
components,
right. Yeah,
the
that's what
components.
that's where it goes. Is Taiwan's making a lot of the semiconductors for those components,
Hmm.
so they need Taiwan.
Right. Well, China's making, even though you don't know it, what we're talking on now, and I don't care what brand you have, is
Hmm.
Chinese.
Yeah,
No matter what's on the outside of it.
yeah. And
All Apple material is Chinese. All of it.
Apple, Nvidia, Intel, all of
Yeah.
it.
But even the stuff that it doesn't, I don't want to say names because it doesn't matter. I'm telling you, it every brand you know has Chinese components in it, no matter what they tell you, because that's where it comes from.
Yeah,
Like it's, and that's okay. That's
from the
the way.
silicon alone. I mean, that
That's what I'm
it's
talking
part
about.
of the
Even if
makeup.
it's just a piece of the silicon in there, if the plastic parts come from somewhere else, okay, it wouldn't work with the silicon components. However, it's worse than that. It's more than the silicon.
Yeah,
It's almost everything on the inside. All the things that actually make your computer be a computer is probably from China.
or
Even if
from
it's from,
Taiwan.
correct,
Because
correct.
Taiwan does 94% of advanced semiconductors is Taiwan, and
Right,
then
but look where they're
the
getting their
other
raw
is
materials.
South Korea.
Taiwan's a small island with a bunch of people. They're not getting raw materials from Taiwan. They're
Right,
just putting it together there.
right.
The components, I'm telling you, are coming from right next door, that big old country that's making everything for Apple and a
Yeah.
bunch of other people and half of Walmart.
Hmm. And that's what's kind of weird is they're both China and Russia are sharing this weird dependency on Ukraine to Russia, as is Taiwan to China, because Russia's dependent on Ukraine as well for their oil trade, because they run a lot of their pipelines through Ukraine right now.
Yes, yes, and that's a very, very good point.
Hmm.
I believe that was part of the reason why we were in Afghanistan. They claim it was for the war on terror, and that may have been a reason. However, Afghanistan is rich in geographic location, poppy seeds, and areas to run pipelines through,
Hmm.
not to mention other political issues that were created by the United States and other countries. So, and the Ukraine's just a couple of small countries away from Afghanistan, if not right next door. I'm trying to remember my geography. But
Kind of
Ukraine's
close.
right there, yeah, and they have, as you said, great oil reserves, a port, and many, many pipelines that run to Europe from Russia and other countries. So they're certainly a strategic and a military strategic and economically strategic point of
Hmm.
contention. And undoubtedly, that's one of the reasons why Russia wants them. But culturally and historically, they're pretty much the same folks. I'm sure the Ukrainians and the Russians would say, well, they're not Russian, and Ukrainians were, we're Ukrainians, we're not Russian. But to everybody else,
Well, that they don't care about everybody else's thoughts. They care
right,
about their own
right,
independency,
right,
and
right,
that's why there's a civil war happening
right.
constantly there, because of that particular dichotomy between the citizens. You
Hmm.
know, obviously you have the Western more gearing towards a NATO side, and the Eastern is more Russian side, because the close proximity of the propaganda between
Yeah,
one
their
another.
families are probably going across the border in oxen carts for centuries, and
Hmm.
only in the 20th century has it been an issue.
Hmm.
You know, and that's hard to shake. You remember it. Even if
Hmm.
you don't, even if you didn't live it, you've been told the stories by all of your family members from the time you could walk, and they were told their stories, and they were told their stories. So it never goes away.
Hmm.
But for the modern world, their military and economic um, viability is something that is greatly desired by everyone. And Russia looks at it as, well, they're a part of us, or they should be. So why don't you just come back and we'll pretend like this didn't happen and move forward. And of course, because of who they are, the European and North American countries simply want to say, you can come over here. You don't have to listen to them. It's a we understand, and because each wants to profit off the other. And don't get me wrong, the Ukraine wants to profit too. They stand to make a lot more money dealing with Europe than they do with Russia. especially as a Russian state.
Right. Well, it's definitely right now the economy for Russia is really hurting, especially after the Crimean annex. Apparently, NATO decided to cut off a bunch of because they don't acknowledge the annex that
Hmm.
happened. Apparently, Crimean referendum happened and like 89% voter turnout, and 94% of them supposedly voted to be part of Russia again. And Russia was like, okay,
Hmm.
we'll take
Hmm.
you in, and NATO did not like that.
Well, if that's true, if that was,
If that's true, if
yeah,
this
if that's an
is.
actual thing, and we have to be, but if that's true, if that was a real election that was held with
Mhm.
actual counted votes and it went that way, that sounds like a classic case of democracy working in a way that you didn't think it would, but you have to accept the results because it's a
It's a
true
democracy.
democratic result,
Right.
right?
Exactly. That's where it's really interesting. I'm like, oh, okay, I
Hmm.
see how we're pulling this NATO and
Hmm.
Western civilization. Like, shouldn't we be for the
So they're
diplomacy
just they're just using
or
the
the
words as a smokescreen
democracy,
instead
I
of,
should say?
right.
Right.
They're using the words democracy as a smokescreen instead of a reality.
And that's
And
where there's a lot of angles on these articles where they
right,
skew it towards these gunpoint referendums, is how they put them. Gunpoint
right.
referendum.
Like, well,
And
yeah.
and they could be.
Why you use that word though? That's a very curious phrase, and it evokes certain images in your mind and compulsions and that kind of thing. And that's what I said. I mentioned that they describe them as autocrats. Why don't you just simply say country leaders if you don't want to
Hmm.
say their titles? There's
Yeah.
nation leaders. There's all sorts of euphemisms you could have used, but you used that one. And I'm not so sure that they're as autocratic as they're made out to be. Not like North Korea, where it's
Yeah.
commonly seen and known that if you disagree with the presidential leader, you're just taken out back
Right.
and never seen again. So, and I don't
Now
know if
I'm not
that
sure about
happens
China.
there.
China's pretty crazy. Not North Korea crazy, but
Yeah, and I'm not saying they don't. I'm just saying there's not a whole lot of evidence that supports it's that severe. And if you say, well, if you go against the president in China, you could just go away. I'm like, well, you
same
do
thing in
that.
Russia.
It
Same thing
uh,
in I guess here too. Supposedly,
right, yeah.
if you're
If you were
verbal enough.
a real threat, and I mean no violence, no threats of violence, but a real political threat that wasn't entrenched in any of the traditional modes of politics, you would get a visit from guys in suits and a lot of guns, and you wouldn't have a choice about going to talk to somebody. So there's really no telling, what would happen. So I don't see that as being markedly different in theory, but
If not that much, they would definitely have some scare tactics involved where they'd bring you into, an interrogation room and question you for hours upon
right.
hours.
And some people would argue that's not a scare tactic. That's just prudent. You've made
Mm,
some threats. I'm like, I'm not saying you make some threat. I'm saying the exact opposite. You're not advocating violence of any sort. You're simply saying that that person is not a person you should put your faith and trust in and shouldn't pay any attention to him. He's just sitting in a chair. You should just do what you want, like creating your own political party without any ties to the traditional machinery of
mhm,
the government. You would definitely be spoken to
mhm,
and may not be seen again,
mhm.
because that has been tried and has had similar results in the history of this country. Be no different there. The difference there is you could be part of the traditional machinery and speak out against them and go away. Here, if you're part of the traditional machinery and speak out, you just get blasted in the newspapers and ostracized, or so I think there's definitely a real difference. I'm just tongue in cheek earlier,
Right.
about the whole thing, but it's it's easy to cross that line and be told something that may be factual but not entirely true to make you believe a certain thing, is what I'm
Right.
saying.
Mhm.
Right. And that's kind of what we did just in the last 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's very interesting.
Yeah. It's very easy to do. That's what when you start trying to get the other side's point of view on it. That's when I was like, oh, this is a lot deeper than they try to put
Oh yeah.
as in the
Oh
media.
yeah. This has
It's a
been going
lot
on
deeper.
for decades,
Hmm.
decades, and political spin has been made in a number of areas and a number of times to make you believe certain things. It's like they're prepping you for their next thing. It's all building upon the last, but they're aware of what they said last, and they're making sure that they can build upon it. I read an article in the Indian Express, which is a Nation of India newspaper, and I read an English translation, of course, because I don't speak Hindi. But it basically, and it was a long article, but it basically said that this was all simply a lot of posturing and hot air, and they were too economically engaged with Europe and the United States, both of these countries, to really do anything. And I thought that was a bit dismissive as a boomer, because the 20th century was riddled with wars, especially um, between communist and capitalist countries. And these countries, one is still communist, even though they claim to be socialist, the Chinese, but they're using capitalism as their economic base because they realize communism doesn't work.
Mhm.
And Russia still has that mindset. And Putin came from that era. He was a KGB director during the Soviet Union. So he certainly still has that mindset.
Right.
And violence is something they both speak fluently.
Right.
And I know they're not foolish and wouldn't participate in it from a
Yeah,
spur of the moment
I
type
think
thing.
it is a bit dismissive to say there's no way because there's too much economical engage. Like, I don't think that's, but I do think there is hesitancy because of that, though. I do think they are trying to.
And that's good. There should be hesitancy. There's really no reason for it, except that if we do economically isolate these countries, if they try to move forward and realize their geopolitical ambitions and move into the Ukraine, and China moves into Taiwan, and we decide, we're not going to do anything militarily. We're simply going to economically isolate these countries and not have any further trade with them. That would almost force them to militarily engage.
Yeah, with everybody.
Right, right.
Because they're
And ally
dependent.
with each other. Correct. And ally with each other. I mean, they trade with each other now, but trading with two people that have a lot less than everybody else, the trade's not really the same, you know? And
Mhm.
that's basically what it would be. It would be two nation states that are both economically not in the best of shape now. And what are you going to trade? Right?
Yeah, China has a lot more than going for it than Russia does at the time, but
Sure, they do.
they're still very dependent just on food alone. Again, is a big deal.
Now,
They
it could,
don't make enough food for your own people.
right,
That's a problem.
it could motivate them to turn their technology inward to create enough farm
Hmm.
technology so that they could feed their people and do it. Hard times, force hard work and tough decisions, and you end up better off in the end, which has happened in the US a number of times. But that can only take you so far if your people start failing or starving early.
It takes time to make that. It takes time to
Correct.
cultivate agriculture. I
It
mean,
does
it's just
indeed.
simply is what it is. You
Yeah.
can't speed
People
it
aren't
any
going to
further than it
magically
is.
know how to do it, and machines
Hmm.
aren't going to magically show up overnight to till it. And you
Plants
still
aren't going to magically be brought up in 8 months. That just doesn't
correct,
happen.
correct. It's not you're not
People
a
die a
month.
lot faster than 8 months of starving.
Yes, yes. Especially if you're not very large in the first place. You don't
Right.
have a lot of extra fat in the first place.
Hmm.
You know, 3 weeks and you're usually done for.
Yeah.
If an average sized person. So
And you're definitely not tilling the fields anymore after the first week, maybe.
right, right. It's you're being dire straits in a hurry.
Hmm.
So it would not be a good thing. And that's what concerns me. So I see it as a very large, loud statement, and them being in a real pickle as far
Hmm.
as their their personal positions, or they wouldn't making statements in quite that way.
Right. Yeah, I agree. The postulation definitely brings in a certain amount of signs of hesitancy or trying to get people to back down so they have what they want, strong arming a bit. But at the end of the day, I do think they would legitimately are about what they say. I
Oh, I believe that this is not simply blow and smoke.
Mhm.
they do see each other as somebody that can be relied upon because they're in the same boat,
Hmm.
and they have the same enemies in their mind. They have the
Hmm.
same people being hostile to them, and they're going to go, you know what? Everybody else doesn't like us, but we like each other, even though we can't trust each other
Hmm.
completely. We're in the same boat. So
The old
the
enemy of my enemy is my
it
friend.
exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. But they're announcing it. I mean, we
Hmm.
knew this already, but they're announcing it very loudly and in a manner that lets you know it's complete, that they're with each other.
Yeah, especially the timing right during the Olympics held in China,
Oh
showing
yeah, they wanted the world's attention focused upon their statement. That's part
yeah,
of my point.
yeah,
Correct. Yes.
definitely a lot of posturing happening.
Hmm. Well, that's what all countries do, to let
Hmm.
people know where they stand and what they think, and to gauge the reaction and all that. And I'm sure that's exactly what they're doing right now. And all their people are reading all these Western articles about what they said. It would be interesting to see what they think about that Indian article, essentially saying it's just a bunch of hot air. Don't take it too seriously. Not using those words, but in that tone. And so, yeah, they did say it, and I'm sure that they may do something, but probably not.
Well, they I'm leaning more towards not, only because both in the end are dependent on those countries and also are already in the works of making projects to not be dependent on those countries any longer. Like Russia has a project pipeline infrastructure going through the Black Sea to Turkey instead of running through Ukraine anymore. That's already been in the works for quite some time now. So they're already trying to circumvent that dependency, that main dependency on Ukraine, as China's trying to still trying to be part of the semiconductor industry. They're still trying to take that over. They've been doing that forever.
Yeah, but with China, it seems more like a point of pride as opposed to a point of political expediency, or
Hmm.
economic expediency, because while Taiwan makes a lot of money because they're the gateway to the West from China, it wouldn't magically become the country's. People can just send that digital money somewhere else and it's gone. They're not going to have it. It's it in there, in what all the articles I read, even written from a Western point of view, that Taiwan's always been a Chinese territory, except when the Japanese occupied it during World War II. And it's just been a matter of legalities and political machinations that have kept it from being ruled by the mainland Chinese government. Although
Right.
the Taiwanese would vehemently disagree.
Mm.
That's what everybody else claims.
I suppose the same situation of Hong Kong, where Hong Kong's technically always been China, but technically it's been its own sovereign nation, technically because of British
Its own city
ruling.
state, because
Right.
of similar
Hmm.
idea, although not exactly the same, but yes, similarly. And
Hmm.
yeah, something like that.
Yeah, what I was trying to get at was with I've always been under the influence that China, Russia bad is the usual undertone of all media platforms in Western civilization
Well,
that I've.
that's okay. So you still get that from the media as well, that
Mhm. And
there
I've
are.
not even been, I know we've been taught this through schooling, and history buffs have told this forever as the Cold War ended, but I'm still under the impression it really didn't. We still have constant cyber fighting with each other, constantly trying,
Hmm, hmm,
sabotage, propaganda, inflicting on one another, constantly throwing money at neighboring countries to try to
hmm.
mess with one another. I don't think the Cold War really ever ended. Maybe the threat of nuclear war ever ended, kind of,
Well, the
but.
Cold War ended in the classic sense, meaning, you know, you didn't have this single monolithic enemy of the Soviet Union, all united, all the countries united, and all the governments united into one giant block that you had to make sure they weren't going to steal your secrets so they could invade and take over. And the same with China.
Mhm.
But of course, China, they've simply opened up their trade routes and their economic activity. However, it's still the same government that has gone on since Mao uh, created a revolution and ousted the old Republic of China government. It's the same government. It's just been a succession of the same of leaders for the same chair under the same government rule. Now, with Russia broken up and a new economic and government and constitution ruling it, but again, you have older people like Putin who are under the old Soviet regime who have a similar mindset. But I think you have to respect the fact, even though I don't personally know the guy, nor do I particularly like him with some of the things that he's shown to do. But in his position, I may have done something similar. I don't know, because he's looking out for his own country. He's just trying to make sure his country moves forward economically and they don't stay stuck because of their lack of resources, their lack of technological know-how, and other things. You can certainly go there a lot easier than in the past. You can certainly
Yeah,
create
the visa is a
businesses.
lot more easily obtainable for there, for sure.
And during the Soviet days, it was a years long process, and you had a guide, which was simply a KGB agent with you at all times and only allowed to go to certain places at certain times and couldn't talk to anybody without permission. It was a completely different thing.
Hmm.
That is not the case anymore. They even renamed their cities. It's not Stalingrad and Leningrad anymore. So it's St. Petersburg now, which is the old names. They went back to the old names to show we don't have the Soviet government here anymore. It was legitimately overthrown, and I'm sure Putin was part of that, which is how he became president. So
Hmm.
he knew that it didn't work and doesn't want to go down that road. But I'm curious as to what actual government activities are going on if it's not Soviet. Now it's all hardline still because that's what they know. That's how they've stayed alive. But I don't know. My point is, how violent do will they become if they think they have each other's back? Because you've seen many little pipsqueaks all of a sudden get very confident and start to pick fights if they think they have people that's going to jump in and save them.
Right. I still don't consider them pipsqueaks. They're the other two big military
No, I,
powers of the
I don't
world,
either. I'm just using that as an
besides India,
analogy
I
that
suppose.
someone who would normally not fight now has someone to assist them
Hmm.
is much more willing to fight.
Right.
And that's
Yeah,
my point.
that gives them a lot of confidence to go
Hmm
on with their intentions, for
And I'm
sure.
sure that's exactly what the reason was for that statement, that pact, and the issuance of that statement in that way, saying, hey, it's not just me anymore. And I'm not afraid to do anything because I have resources and a friend that I didn't have before. So you should leave us alone.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm very interested because I've always been interested in Russia. I just suppose it's like a little bit of the forbidden fruit of mankind. You always want to, you're more curious about the things you're not allowed to know or want, or people don't really want you to know about the truth of things. Because I've always noticed that there's been a bit of a certain die on Russian uh, propaganda in general. How, and I'm sure America's very guilty of constantly bombarding Russians with the same thing that Russia is supposedly guilty of, messing with our elections or throwing out crazy propaganda to show how terrible Russians are. I'm sure Russia's does the same thing to us about how America is really bad by, I'm sure, putting in some weird committee that has a bunch of racists involved and none of them are even American, that are apparently affiliated with
Yeah,
some
well,
of
it
the
was
things.
it was shown that the Russians certainly interfered in the national presidential elections with internet
Hmm.
statements and trying to inflame arguments and divide people and all that. So that was certainly some intelligence type movement on their side. And yeah, our side does exactly the same thing
Right.
in a
I know they're
different
guilty
way.
of it.
Yeah, yeah. It's been proven that they have. Um, and again, we've done the same thing. We lied. Oh yeah, we do stuff like that. That's what they're there for. That's what the intelligence agencies do.
Hmm.
Start that kind of thing. And I'm okay with that. Because one, you can't really stop it as much as you think, and as horrible as you may think it is, it's not influencing elections, although you may think it is. Any different than anybody else here who does it, because people are going to believe what they want if they see it. And we're issued a lot of misinformation on purpose already.
Right.
So anyone who's a thinking person can step back and critically evaluate what's actually being said to what's actually going on and extrapolate from there. Now, I know a lot of people don't do that. They just knee jerk reaction, just like the people, the Trump thing that's going on now, just like the people that support him. You have people that are against him and don't really know anything about it other than he's who he is. So he's an unlikable person.
Yeah, he's inflammatory, so that's all they
Yeah.
need to
And
know.
and I get that. I don't, from what I've seen, I don't particularly care for him either, but I don't have a knee jerk reaction. Sometimes he has a good idea, as
Hmm.
much as it might come from a person I don't like.
Hmm.
Often he's been a buffoon, but not all the time. So,
Right.
there you are. And that's how I look at it, which is why I'm not politically connected to anybody or any political
I
party.
see it more of they constantly induce chaos or induce second guessing, or they induce
Who's that? Who's they? Who's
both
it?
USA to Russia and
Oh,
Russia or China to Russia and
again, that's what
so
intelligence
on and so
agencies
forth.
do.
Both,
Cause
right? Not so much that
problems.
they change the outcome of an election, but so much that they cause. I know they're a hard influence in causing, discourse between
I
inner
mean, discord between the two.
discord. Yeah,
Hmm.
discord between one another.
Yeah. And again, you can't against the united people because they look at you like you're crazy if you say something ridiculous. Like, get out of here. So
Hmm.
they find those cracks and chinks in the armor and move forward and try to foment certain problems to make things go. But again, that can backfire on you. So they're doing, and I honestly, I'm not concerned about that. That's been going on forever. It will always go on. It's not violent. It's soft attacks at best, and they can
Hmm.
be dismissed, and you can just not read them. You don't have to participate. You can
True.
see it for what it is. I'm talking about military movement, and that's what concerns me about that statement. So again, it was dismissed in some places, but I don't think it can be dismissed completely. I think I'm not saying we should be cowering in the corner and worried about it, but we should go, okay, we need to reevaluate our plan completely. Although I know those who are at the top and do this for a living to evaluate it, we're already aware of this possibility because they've been chummy off and on for a couple of decades, and they've had trade with each other and saw that that was a definite possibility. It's the
Hmm.
announcement of it and the way they did it, which lets me know that they're worried. And if
Hmm.
they're worried, that's when people do things, you know?
Hmm.
So that's all I'm saying. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up for us. And what is our next podcast?
No idea.
Oh, come on. You don't remember?
Don't remember.
Don't remember. We're going to talk about how can you retain your employees during the big quit or the great resignation? How do you keep your people? Best way to do it. And I can do it from a upper management position, and you can talk about it from a worker and new gen position and what gets people to stay. People who've been there for years and decide I can't do this anymore with some experience and skills, and people who are coming into the job and why they're looking at a particular employer or why they immediately jump to another employer doing the same job or why they may disengage. So we're going to talk about it from those angles and give our best answers as to how you can keep people in that job without breaking the business. Because if you don't have a business, you don't have an employees. There's so, but you do need to make sure you don't mistreat them, or at least let them know that they're appreciated in some capacity. And I know many employers do this already, but many don't. And that's a great reason, I think, why people are jumping ship, people are quitting. So that's our next podcast. Thank you for listening and watching if you're seeing us on YouTube and listening to us on the podcast. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time. I'm Boomer X.
I'm Millennial Z.
Take care, everybody.
Peace.